Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Well, what's interesting about this film, I think, is that it essentially deals with the developed world. I mean, we're very familiar with the concept of inequality in the developing world. Last year, I remember Oxfam brought out a report which more or less said you could fit on the top of or in a double-decker bus the number of people who own the same amount of wealth as the bottom 3.5 billion people in the world. That's to say the top 85 people had as much as the bottom 3.5 billion. But this is different because it's looking at the developed world, and there were some interesting statistics in it about healthcare, for instance. You know, the situation of the person in Scotland whose life expectancy was 54, which was less than the life expectancy of somebody in India. So that wasn't because their earnings were different, it was because of the general conditions in the country relating to the whole idea of the relative well-being, I suppose, of a society. The other thing I think that was quite interesting to observe was that the film kept coming back to the 1980s and the changes that happened then. And in truth, I think the period after the Second World War, from 1945 to 1980, was a period of quite significant social and economic progress. And it was based on this post-war settlement, which itself was really embodied the institutions of the New Deal in the United States and the Bretton Woods institutions and so on. And it was essentially an economics which was Keynesian. But this changed very radically after the oil crisis coming into the 1980s. The whole way of thinking shifted around to a more monetarist approach to politics and economics. And people like Friedrich Hayek, his thinking was hugely influential on people like Mrs. Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, who featured in that. They themselves were not the intellectual force which brought around these changes, which brought in a more unequal society in the developed world, but rather, I think, the intellectual work of people like Hayek and the people who followed him. So, anyway, maybe the best thing for me to do is to make a few remarks, really, about the situation. This film is very Anglophone, featuring both the United States and Britain. I'll probably talk a little bit about where the debate is at the moment about equality, a little bit about Ireland then, how we show up, and conclude with, what does all this mean in a broader European context, particularly in the circumstance of where we are at the moment in Europe, where there's such a huge debate about solidarity and the lack of it, or depending on your point of view. Well, Mrs. Thatcher featured strongly, and people always think, I think, she was a person for her age. But it's quite interesting to see where the present Conservative government in Britain are positioning themselves on questions like fairness and equality in society. And the British Tory party, at one level you can look at it and say they originally opposed the concept of the minimum wage even in Britain. But in the last week or so, the Chancellor, George Osborne, has brought in the concept of what he calls a living wage, which is basically an increase in the minimum wage to £9.35 an hour by 2020. Now, this is all part, I think, of George's scheme to reinvent himself as a kind of a one-nation Disraeli. But apart from that, seeing the ideas of the Tory party as the representative of the workers stretches credulity a little bit. I mean, he did make massive cutbacks on welfare at the same time, and he's more or less emasculated the collective bargaining situation in Britain with the new laws which he intends to bring in relation to trade union organisation. But what is interesting about it, it seems to me, is a recognition that inequality is a huge topic for our times, with people who are ideologically positioned in the way that George Osborne is, or David Cameron, see this and seek to address it in their particular way. It is quite interesting. And there is a growing awareness that inequality is not just debilitating in a social sense, but it tends to undermine economic performance as well. Christine Lagarde of the IMF said fairly recently, she says, recent IMF research tells us that less inequality is associated with greater macroeconomic stability and more sustainable growth. Now, this awareness, I think, is underpinned by an emerging literature, some of which was referred to by Sean in his introduction. The most popular really is Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century. And when my organisation, Task, invited Piketty to Ireland last year, we had an enormous attendance in Croke Park. It was just extraordinary how a book, an economist who wrote this not very exciting 700-page book, it has to be said, could get 650 people to attend his lecture in Croke Park. Well, Piketty's core thesis is that if the rate of return on investment continues to exceed the rate of economic growth, which is a kind of a proxy for wages, wages tend to move more or less in line with economic growth. Well, it says if that happens, inequality will inexorably continue to a point of political and social unsustainability. And this position is compounded by the prospect of changing demography, which really means that growth rates in the economy will tend to be much lower now than they have historically been. We've become, in the post-war situation, used to growth rates 3 to 5%. His view is for the future that's not going to happen. It's going to be down 1–1.5%, that kind of area. And it's because of the age profile of the population. So Piketty has the most popular interest, I suppose, but it's worth recalling that the people mentioned in this book and in this film, and upon whose book this film is supposed to be based, though I think it's very loose basing, I have to say, Wilkinson and Piggott, who both appeared in it. I mean, as early as 2009, they were alerting us to the fact that countries which can minimise inequality, can deliver much better economic performance and social outcomes. But what point they made, and it doesn't feature in the film at all, is they were pointing to the Nordic countries and the smaller open economies of Northern Europe, such as the Netherlands and so on. Okay, well, last month we had, my organisation Task had the privilege of having Professor Sir Anthony Atkinson at our annual conference in Croke Park again. And he's been really at the forefront of research into inequality long before Piketty. In fact, I think Piketty was actually a student of his. But he presents a very interesting set of policies which could bring about a genuine shift in the distribution of income in developed countries. Now, obviously, for obvious reasons, I'm not going to go into them this afternoon, or we'll be here all day. But he deals significantly with one point which was puzzling me with Piketty's research. Piketty talks about the rate of return on investment exceeding the rate of economic growth, and this causing the problem. But yet we know that at the moment the rate of return on investment, if you have any savings in the bank or the post office, you get little or nothing for them. But Piketty doesn't explain this, but actually Tony Atkinson does. The point he makes is the real rate of return you're thinking about is what the insurance companies and the superannuation companies manage to invest and charge for that money. The real rate of return, which goes to the financial services sector, in other words, is completely different than the rate of return that you and I might expect if we put our millions in the post office or in the banks. So the problem, as he defines it, is not just that the rich are getting richer, but we're failing to tackle poverty, and the economy is rapidly changing to leave the majority of people behind. That's essentially what he says. And we can see this actually in the growth of precarious work, like 0 hours contracts, for example, a lot of which was covered in the film there with the people working in McDonald's and the fast food industry. But also, I think, the hollowing out of the labour market. When I was young, when I was coming into the labour market, you had a good chance of getting a good job in a middle-level income in the bank, or in maybe being an electrician or a carpenter or something like that. A lot of that has been hollowed out in the way the labour market is moving, where you have, very highly paid, highly qualified people on the one hand, but an awful lot of people falling back into a kind of a low-paid private services industry. And this is a long-run secular trend, which, as again was mentioned in the film, is kind of exacerbated by a change in the balance of power between capital and labour. Now, how did that come about? This isn't explained in the film, actually. But it really came about when China joined the global market and when the Soviet Union collapsed. So you had whole regions of the world who weren't plugged into the global economy as we saw it. But more or less overnight, you had 1.5 billion people joining the industrial workforce, which at that time was around 900 million people. So you can see, of course, so many more people trying to share in the pot of prosperity, clearly accept the balance of power between the forces of capital, who would use those people to make more products and more money and so on, and the people who would be trying to maximise the rate of return for their labour. So that's a huge change. And if you want an example of it, of that change in the balance of power, probably in our own country the most egregious recent example was the Cleary's situation, where people who had worked for that company all their lives were more or less thrown out at the end. One man, I remember, worked for 40 years, just thrown out, nothing at the end of the day, no warning, a big deal between people, investment funds and so on, buying into the company. So this is where we are at the moment. This is the reality, I suppose, of the modern world of capitalism. So, just perhaps turning from the general to the specific, two of my colleagues in task, Nat O'Connor and Cormac Staunton, this year produced this report, which is quite interesting, Cherishing All Equally, Economic Inequality in Ireland. And they used quite an interesting system of a number of indicators. I mean, they came to the conclusion you cannot just say measure inequality based on income alone. You also have to look at things like taxation, family composition, the capacities of people, the cost of goods and services, wealth generally and its distribution, and public services. Public services are very important because they undermine, they create a sort of a threshold of decency, let's say, for decent living for people, which are much more important to people at the lower end of the spectrum maybe than they are for people who are in middle incomes and can afford to buy some of these services privately. But they look particularly at the question of low pay, and they say it's particularly relevant in Ireland because you have a high level of low pay, around 20% of the people are in that category, but you also have a very inadequate level by European standards of public services. Now, we all know that this is something which concerns the public at large. You tend to have this debate very regularly on radio and television. What you don't tend to have is a conjunction of ideas between, say, the tax necessary to pay for these services and the level of the services themselves. But low pay is a feature of rising inequality. And while average incomes in Ireland have more than doubled, I think, since the 1970s in real terms, the average for the top 10 has tripled, and the average for the top 1% has gone up fivefold. And you can see that, I think, in that particular chart that's up there at the moment. And during the period of economic growth from the early 1990s, the share of income earned by the top 10% of the people rose, meaning that the vast majority of people, the bottom 90% of the population, lost a proportionate share of national income. The top 10% in Ireland take something like 34% of all income. That's up from 27% in the 1970s. But they represent only 12% of the working age population. The bottom 90%, on the other hand, has fallen to about 66% of all income, down from about 72% as it was in around 1975 or so. Can you flip the next chart? That will hopefully show the second chart comes up. There you are. Yeah, you can actually begin to see that the top 1%, which is the mauve-coloured line, you can see how that has grown very steadily, and you can see how, in the case of the other cohort of the population, the much bigger part of the population has dropped significantly over that time. And in fact, Ireland is now the most unequal country in the OECD when it comes to what's called market inequality. And this we can see by reference to the Gini coefficient, which is a measure of equality based on income. If you flick to the next one, please, if you can. Hopefully, yeah. You can see that Ireland is very, very high up on the list there. Now, the reason for that, I suppose the income inequality doesn't manifest itself quite so egregiously in what we know of our day-to-day living standards. But the reason for that is that social protection is very good at affecting a transfer of income here and bringing people down from a very bad situation in terms of their wages and earnings to a position where, relatively speaking, within the EU, we're not too bad at all. We're more or less at the level of the rest of the EU, which there's the next table now, which we can flick, if we flick onto. Yeah, exactly. You can show that the effect of the Gini coefficient before there are any transfers and the effect afterwards. And you can see also that the biggest difference is made by the social transfers rather than the taxation system. So, as inequality rises, the difficulty is that it becomes more difficult to make changes in that, to make that system of transfers effective. And the reason is, quite frankly, that you have a lower and diminishing tax base from which to do this. Like if everybody is on precarious work, if they're working 15 hours a week and they have very low incomes, you can't raise enough taxes from them in order to make the transfers that you want to make. It's a kind of a vicious circle, in fact. And to really tackle inequality, it's important that we do address this market income side. Pre-distribution, as is sometimes referred to. Ed Miliband in England seemed to be the first one to use this expression. But it basically means, what everybody earns. And what the Tories are doing in Britain at the moment now is quite interesting, because they're at one level forcing employers to pay more money on the basic wage, but at the same time they're deconstructing the social welfare support system. And, the net result of that will not make a significant change, I would have thought, in inequality. And it's most important that we wouldn't do anything just like that here. You need to do both together. This is the point. The social transfers are extremely important, as well as the basic wage idea. Now, the concept of a living wage is something TASC is trying to develop along with the Vincentian Partnership and the Nevin Institute and a number of others. And Micheál Collins is a former Trinity man, but he's working for the Nevin Institute at the moment. He's doing very, very good work on this. And there is a kind of quite a reliable system to calculate basically what do you need to actually live, as distinct from the minimum wage. And it's calculated at the moment. Initially, a year or so ago, it was $11.40. It's up to $11.50 now. That is the threshold, and that is where we would need to be, I think, so that we could have everybody in a reasonably decent position as far as keeping bread on the table is concerned. I think, in fairness, the government is to be commended for its action in establishing the Low Pay Commission. Because, a lot of people will probably find the initial findings in relation to the minimum wage a bit disappointing, but on the other hand, it is an institution now of the labour market, the labour market, which will continue for indefinitely, basically. So if the government wanted to, over a period of time, I think it would be possible to move up to that living wage. And I think that should be the ambition of public policy at any rate. Also, I think, in fairness, they have introduced legislation recently which will improve the position of collective bargaining, which in Ireland was extremely bad from a legal standpoint. Again, it's a complex area I won't go into, but I think it will make significant changes in trying to affect collective bargaining and this area of pre-distribution that I have referred to. Hopefully it will be possible then to tackle inequality more efficiently in Ireland. I'll just finally, Sean, I know you just take 2 minutes to wrap up on this point. There is a European dimension to this as well, because since the onset of the 2008 crisis, the ideal of social Europe has more or less been eviscerated. We're in the grip of a Hayekian nightmare, as in our friend Friedrich Hayek, really which, if it persists, this is the policy in Europe, could potentially destroy the European integration project itself. You don't need me to convince you of that. I think anyone who's read the newspaper or watched television for a while will know that there's a huge risk in this. And the problem is the dominance of the ECB as an institution and the narrowness of its remit within Europe is quite a catastrophic flaw, I would say. And really what we need, I think, to make progress, and the Germans will oppose this tooth and nail, but you need to change the remit of the ECB to be a little bit more like the Federal Reserve in the United States, believe it or not, because the Federal Reserve in the United States has to take account of unemployment and various conditions in the economy, while at the same time managing price stability. The European system concerns itself only with price stability. It does not have to be concerned with 26 million people unemployed in Europe, for instance. Now, you may well say, and it can be legitimately pointed out, if the Fed is so good, why is the United States so bad? The point is, though, that through this system, by privileging price stability and sound money above everything else, effectively the ECB is presiding over the unravelling of all the institutions of the labour market in Europe, which would have given us a much better level of equality in the social market economies of Europe than we have come to expect in the Anglophone countries, particularly the United States. Now, that is why I think it is so important, and if Europe is ever to move forward from where it is stuck at the moment, that would have to be dealt with. Finally, I'll just say one point that Tony Atkinson makes in his book, overall, which is quite compelling. He says, it does matter that some people can buy tickets for space travel while others are queuing for food banks. That's the reality of our life, and therefore the fight against inequality, I think, is probably one of the biggest challenges of our time.